path-dependent change. The world was changing in the 1870s and 80s. Latin America was no exception. The institutions that Porfirio Diaz established were not identical to those of Santa Anna or the Spanish colonial state. The world economy boomed in the second half of the 19th century, and innovations in transportation such as the steamship and railway led to a huge expansion of the international trade. The wave of globalization meant that resources-rich countries such as Mexico, or more appropriately the elites in such countries, could enrich themselves by exporting raw materials and natural resources to industrializing North America or Western Europe. Diaz and his colonies thus found themselves in a different and rapidly evolving world. They realized that Mexico had to change too, but this did not mean uprooting the colonial institutions and replacing them with institutions similar to those in the United States. Instead, theirs was path-dependent change, leading only to the next stage of the institutions that had already made much of Latin America poor and unequal. Globalization made the large open spaces of the Americas, its open frontiers, valuable. Often these frontiers were only mythically open, since they were inhabited by indigenous peoples who were brutally dispossessed. All the same, the scramble for this newly valuable resource was one of the defining processes of the Americas in the second half of the 19th century. The sudden opening of this valuable frontier led not to parallel processes in the United States and Latin America, but to a further divergence shaped by the existing institutional differences, especially those concerning who had access to the land. In the United States, a long series of legislative acts ranging from the Land Ordinance of 1785 to the Homestead Act of 1862 gave broad access to the frontier lands. Though indigenous peoples had been streamlined, this created an egalitarian and economically dynamic frontier. In most Latin American countries, however, the political institutions there created a very different outcome. Frontier lands were allocated to the politically powerful and those with wealth and contacts, making such people even more powerful. Diaz also started to dismantle many of the specific colonial institutional legacies preventing international trade, which he anticipated could greatly enrich him and his supporters. His model, however, continued to be not the type of economic development he saw north of the Rio Grande, but that of Cortes, Pizarro and de Toledo, where the elite would make huge fortunes while the rest were excluded. When the elite invested, the economy would grow a little, but such economic growth was always going to be disappointing. It also came at the expense of those lacking rights in this new order, such as the Yaqui people of Sonora in the hinterland of Nogales. Between 1900 and 1910, possibly 30,000 Yaqui were deported, essentially enslaved, and sent to work in the henequen plantations of Yucatan. The fibers of the Yucayan plant were a valuable export since they could be used to make rope and twine. The persistence into the 20th century of the specific institutional pattern inimical to growth in Mexico and Latin America is well illustrated by the fact that, just as in the 19th century, the pattern generated economic stagnation and political instability. Civil civil wars and coups as groups struggled for the benefits of power. Diaz finally lost power to revolutionary forces in 1910. The Mexican Revolution was followed by others in Bolivia in 1952, Cuba in 1959, Nicaragua in 1979. Meanwhile, sustained civil wars raged in Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Peru. Expropriation or the threat of the expropriation of assets continued apace, with mass agrarian reforms or attempted reforms in Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Guatemala, Peru, and Venezuela. Revolutions, expropriations, and political instability came along with military governments and various types of dictatorships. Though there was also a gradual drift towards greater political rights. It was only in the 1990s that most Latin American countries became democracies, and even they remained mired in instability. This instability was accompanied by mass repression and murder. The 1991 National Commission for Truth and Reconciliation report in Chile determined that 2,279 persons were killed for political reasons during the Pinochet dictatorship between 1973 and 1990. Possibly 50,000 were imprisoned and tortured, and hundreds of thousands of people were fired from their jobs. The Guatemalan Commission for Historical Clarification report in 1999 identified a total of 42,275 named victims, though others have claimed that as many as 200,000 were murdered in Guatemala between 1962 and 1996. 70,000 during the regime of General Efrain Rio Montt, who was able to commit these crimes with such impunity that he could run for president in 2003. Fortunately, he did not win. The National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons in Argentina put the number of people murdered by the military there at 9,000 persons from 1976 to 1983, although it noted that the actual number could be higher. Estimates by human rights organizations usually place it at 30,000, making a billion or two. The enduring implications of the organization of the colonial society and those societies' institutional legacies shape the modern differences between the United States and Mexico, and thus the two parts of Nogales. The contrast between how Bill Gates and Carlos Slim became the two richest men in the world. Warren Buffett is also a contender, illustrates the forces at work. The rise of Gates in Microsoft is well known, but Gates' status as the world's richest person and the founder of one of the most technologically innovative companies did not stop the US Department of Justice from filing civil actions against the Microsoft Corporation on May 8, 1998, claiming that Microsoft had abused monopoly power. Particularly at issue was the way that Microsoft had tied its web browser, Internet Explorer, to its Windows operating system. The government had been keeping an eye on Gates for quite some time, and as early as 1991, the Federal Trade Commission had launched an inquiry into whether Microsoft was abusing its monopoly on PC operating system. In November 2001, Microsoft reached a deal with the Justice Department. It had its wings clipped, even if the penalties were less than many demands. In Mexico, Carlos Slim did not make his money by innovation. Initially, he excelled in stock market deals and is buying and ramping unprofitable firms. His major coup was the acquisition of Telmex, the Mexican telecommunications monopoly that was privatized by President Carlos Salinas in 1990. The government announced its intention to sell 51% of the voting stock, 20.4% of the total stock in the company in September 1989 and received bids in November 1990. A consortium led by Slim's Grupo Garso won the auction. Instead of paying for the shares right away, Slim managed to delay payment, using the dividends of Telmex itself to pay for the stock. What was once a public monopoly now became Slim's monopoly, and it was hugely profitable. The economic institutions that made Carlos Slim who is are very different from those in the United States. If you are a Mexican entrepreneur, entry barriers will play a crucial role at every stage of your career. These barriers include expensive licenses you have to obtain, red tape you have to cut through, politicians and incumbents who will stand in your way, and difficulty of getting funding from the financial sector, often in courts and with the incumbents you are trying to compete against. These barriers can be either insurmountable, keeping you out of lucrative areas, or your greatest friends, keeping your competitors at bay. The difference between the two scenarios is, of course, whom you know and whom you can influence, and yes, whom you can bribe. Carlos Slim, a talented, ambitious man from a relatively modest background of Lebanese immigrants, has been a master at obtaining exclusive contracts. He managed to monopolize the lucrative telecommunications market in Mexico and then to extend his reach to the rest of the Latin America. There have been challenges to Slim's Telemax monopoly, but they have not been successful. In 1996, Avantel, a long-distance phone provider, petitioned the Mexican Competition Commission to check whether Telemax had a dominant position in the telecommunications market. In 1997, the Commission declared that Telemax had substantial monopoly power with respect to local telephony, national long-distance calls and international long-distance calls, among other things, but attempts by the regulatory authorities in Mexico to limit these monopolies have come to nothing. One reason is that Slim and Telemax can use what is known as recurso de amparo, literally an appeal for protection. An amparo is in effect a petition to argue a particular law does not apply to you. The idea of the amparo dates back to the Mexican Constitution of 1857 and was originally intended as a safeguard of individual rights and freedoms. In the hands of Telemax and other Mexican monopolies, however, it has become a formidable tool for cementing monopoly power. Rather than protecting people's rights, the amparo provides a loophole in equality before the law. Slim has made his money in the Mexican economy in large part thanks to his political connections. When he has ventured into the United States, he has not been successful. In 1999, his Grupo Garso brought the computer retailer CompUSA. At the time, CompUSA had given a franchise to a firm called COC Services to sell its merchandise in Mexico. Slim immediately violated this contract with intention of setting up his own chain of stores without any competition from COC, but COC sued CompUSA in a Dallas court. There are no Paros in Dallas, so Slim lost and was fined 454 million. The lawyer for COC, Mark Warner, noted afterward that the message of this verdict is that in this global economy, firms have to respect the rules of the United States if they want to come here. On appeal, however, the verdict was overturned because the judge took the view that there was insufficient evidence toward a theory of world inequality. We live in an unequal world. The differences among nations are similar to those between the two parts of the Nogales, just on a larger scale. In rich countries, individuals are healthier, live longer, and are much better educated. They also have access to a range of amenities and options in life, from vacations to career paths, that people in poor countries can only dream of. People in rich countries also drive on roads without potholes and enjoy toilets, electricity, and running water in their houses. They also typically have governments that do not arbitrarily arrest or harass them. On the contrary, the governments provide services including education, healthcare, roads, and law and order. Notable, too, is the fact that the citizens vote in elections and have some voice in the political direction their countries take. The great differences in world inequality are evident to everyone, even to those in poor countries, though many lack access to television or the internet. It is the perception and reality of these differences that drive people to cross the Rio Grande or the Mediterranean Sea illegally to have the chance to experience rich country living standards and opportunities. This inequality does not just have consequences for the lives of the individual people in poor countries. It also causes grievances and resentment with huge political consequences in the United States and elsewhere. Understanding why these differences exist and what causes them in our focus in this book. Developing such an understanding is not just an end in itself, but also a first step towards generating better ideas about how to improve the lives of billions who still live in poverty. The disparities on the two sides of the fence in Nogales are just the tip of the iceberg, as in the rest of the northern Mexico, which benefits from trade with the United States, even if not all of it is legal. The residents of Nogales are more prosperous than other Mexicans, whose average annual household income is around $5,000. This greater relative prosperity of Nogales, Sonora, comes from the maquiladora manufacturing plants centered in industrial parks, the first of which was started by Richard Campbell, Jr., a California basket manufacturer. The first tenant was Cuisinart, a musical instrument company owned by Richard Boss, owner of the Artley Flute and Saxophone Company in Nogales, Arizona. Cuisinart was followed by Memorex computer wiring event, hospital clothing, Grant sunglasses, Chamberlain, a manufacturer of garage door openers for Sears, and Samsonite suitcases. Significantly, all are US based businesses and businessmen using US capital and know-how. The greater prosperity of Nogales, Sonora relative to the rest of the Mexico therefore comes from outside. The differences between the United States and the Mexico are in turn small compared with those across the entire globe. The average citizens of the United States is 7 times as prosperous as the average Mexican, more than 10 times as the resident of the Peru or Central America. She is about 20 times as prosperous as the average inhabitant of sub-Saharan Africa, and almost 40 times as those living in the poorest African countries such as Mali, Ethiopia and Sierra Leone. And it's not just the United States. There is a small but growing group of rich countries, mostly in Europe and North America, joined by Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Singapore, South Korea and Taiwan, whose citizens enjoy very different lives from those of the inhabitants of the rest of the globe. The reason that Nogales, Arizona is much richer than Nogales, Sonora is simple. It is because of the very different institutions on the two sides of the border, which create very different incentives for the inhabitants of the Nogales, Arizona versus Nogales, Sonora. The United States is also far richer today than either Mexico or Peru because of the way its institutions, both economic and political, shape the incentives of businesses, individuals and politicians. Each society functions with a set of economic and political rules created and enforced by the state and the citizens collectively. Economic institutions shape economic incentives, the incentives to become educated, to save and invest, to innovate and adopt new technologies, and so on. It is the political process that determines what economic institutions people live under, and it is the political institutions that determine how this process works. For example, it is the political institutions of the nation that determine the ability of citizens to control politicians and influence how they behave. This in turn determines whether politicians are agents of the citizens, albeit imperfect, are able to abuse the power entrusted to them, or that they have aspired to amass their own fortune and to pursue their own agendas, once detrimental to those of the citizens. Political institutions include but are not limited to written constitutions and to whether the society is a democracy. They include the power and capacity of the state to regulate and govern society. It is also necessary to consider more broadly, in fact, the factors that determine how political power is distributed in society, particularly the ability of different groups to act collectively to pursue their objectives or to stop other people from pursuing theirs. As institutions influence behavior and incentives in real life, they forge the success or failure of nations. Individual talent matters at every level of society, but even that needs an institutional framework to transform it into a positive force. Bill Gates, like other legendary figures in the information technology industry, such as Paul Allen, Steve Ballmer, Steve Jobs, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, and Jeff Bezos, had immense talent and ambition, but he ultimately responded to incentives. The schooling system in the United States enabled Gates and others like him to acquire a unique set of skills to complement their talent. The economic institutions in the United States enabled these men to start companies with ease without facing insurmountable barriers. Those institutions also made the financing of their profits feasible. The US labor markets enabled them to hire qualified personnel, and the relatively competitive market environment enabled them to expand their companies and market their products. These entrepreneurs were confident from the beginning that their dream projects could be implemented. They trusted the institutions and rule of law that these generated. They did not worry about the security of their property rights. Finally, the political institutions ensured stability and continuity. For one thing, they made sure that there was no risk of the dictator taking power and changing the rules of the game, expropriating their wealth, imprisoning them, or threatening their lives and livelihoods. They also made sure that no particular interest in society could wrap the government in an economically disastrous direction, because political power was both limited and distributed sufficiently broadly that a set of economic institutions that created the incentives for prosperity could emerge. This book will show that while economic institutions are critical for determining whether a country is poor or prosperous, it is politics and political institutions that determine what economic institutions a country has. Ultimately, the good economic institutions of the United States resulted from the political institutions that gradually emerged after 1619. Our theory for world inequality shows how political and economic institutions interact in causing poverty and prosperity, and how different parts of the world ended up with such different sets of institutions. Our brief review of the history of the Americas begin to give a sense of the forces that shape political and economic institutions. Different patterns of institutions today are deeply rooted in the past, because once society gets organized in a particular way, this tends to persist. We will show that this fact comes from the way that political and economic institutions interact. This persistence and the forces that create it also explain why it is so difficult to remove world inequality and to make poor countries prosperous. Though institutions are the key to the differences between the two localities and between Mexico and the United States, that does not mean there will be a consensus in Mexico to change institutions. There is no necessity for the society to develop or adopt the institutions that are best for economic growth or the welfare of its citizens, because other institutions may be even better for those who control politics and political institutions. The powerful and the rest of the society will often disagree about which set of institutions should remain in place and which ones should be changed. Carlos Slim would not have been happy to see his political connections disappear and the entry barriers protecting his businesses fizzle, no matter that the entry of new businesses would enrich millions of Mexicans. Because there is no such consensus, what rule society ends up with is determined by politics, who has power and how this power can be exercised. Carlos Slim has the power to get what he wants. Bill Gates' power is far more limited. That's why our theory is about not just economics but also politics. It is about the effects of institutions on the success and failure of nations. Thus, the economics of poverty and prosperity. It is also about how institutions are determined and change over time, and how they fail to change even when